The Frontline podcast is brought to you by Legion Technologies. Hourly employees want and need flexibility and predictability. They desire more connection and belonging with their peers and companies. And businesses want to maximize productivity while enhancing employee engagement to reduce turnover. Who said we can't have it all? The Frontline podcast is focused on discussing the challenges that come along with having an hourly workforce and shedding light on these important employees who are so often overlooked. You'll hear from leaders bringing transformational and innovative change to their organizations and ways you can improve your own experience and the experiences of your employees, no matter where you sit in your organization. At Legion, we believe that AI-powered workforce management solves these challenges. I'm your host, Tracy Chernoff, Director of Employee Engagement at Legion Technologies, and the host of the podcast, Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources. Be sure to subscribe to the Frontline podcast. Learn more at legion.co. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn, and get ready to be part of the solution. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I'm really excited about this month's guest, Anthony Ladd, who is a colleague of mine. And I'm just going to jump right in. Normally, I do a little intro and, go through the whole thing, but there's no one that introduces themselves better than the guest. So, Anthony, welcome to the Frontline podcast. I'm glad we were able to bring you on. And actually, I'm going to just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are, where you're currently located, and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Anthony Ladd. I am VP of Product at Legion Technologies. My background is in retail. My career started in retail. I started running stores, started running a district. I helped do change management, rolling out a workforce management software 15 years ago, and then managed workforce management software for a good period of time there at Dollar General. I joined Legion about a year ago to help with our product strategy and to help bring some of my industry experience with workforce management to Legion.
Amazing. And I think that we're going to get into some really amazing discussion today focused on the ROI behind demand forecasting. But before we even get into the meat and potatoes of our discussion today, can you share a little bit about your career journey and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. So like I said, my background was in retail. I was recruited directly out of college to Dollar General. And the idea was to get some experience early on, like ground level experience, frontline experience. And I can tell you it has served me very well in my career. That was probably one of the best decisions, a little bit of luck that I was recruited specifically for that to help develop me to understand retail from the perspective of a frontline employee. Managers, without doubt, have the toughest job, I think, in the country. Frontline managers, like managing retail is tough. There are a lot of things that managers have to balance, and I think that their job has only continued to get tougher since when I ran a store. So I started running a store and then running a district briefly before getting pulled into workforce management. And my career, I rose up through Dollar General doing workforce management, and then later doing technology implementations.
Wow. This is where you and I have similar backgrounds because I also was in retail right outside of college. I know we've talked about this. And for me, that was Target. And so for you, Dollar General, me, Target, those are huge stores and businesses with an incredible amount of market share. But what's really interesting is that I have really it's like an identical explanation of what is kind of the takeaway for me leaving retail is that there's so much knowledge that you leave with. There's an awareness, almost like an awakening and an understanding of what people go through day in and day out. And now we're not in retail, but we certainly support retailers in many ways. And, there isn't one day that goes by where I'm not thinking, about that retail experience, or even taking those experiences with me, which is why I'm really excited about the topic that we're covering today, which is about demand forecasting and the ROI, the return on the investment. And, I recognize that some listeners might not have any clue as to what demand forecasting really is. And we'll probably talk a little bit about our experiences in retail too, potentially. We'll touch on that. So kind of coming back to this notion that not everyone might know what demand forecasting is, can you first explain what it is for anyone who might not be familiar?
Yeah. So when we think of demand, we're talking about the things that drive work. That could be customers, it could be transactions, it could be just the work associated in the store. So a truck arrives, or a truck needs to get unloaded, or stocking shelves. It's all the work drivers that are going into a store. When we think about just demand forecasting, we really want to focus on the things that we can predict. Think about customers or items that they're buying, and whether the customers buy, how much labor is needed to service that customer. Some business models are very high service oriented or high sales oriented, and so there's a lot of time that a salesperson or a sales associate must invest in helping to convert into a sale. In other business models or other types of demand, it's not so much that it's not quite as intensive, but it's still creating work for the business. And so demand forecasting is forecasting those individual things that are unique to each business that create work.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And can you explain how better demand forecasting can actually impact scheduling and affect it, scheduling and labor, and how easy it is for businesses to implement demand forecasting? Because we already know there are businesses out there that are still pen to paper, and they are just writing a schedule and not really giving any more thought than that.
Yeah, this is a huge opportunity for a lot of businesses, especially businesses that are still doing it on pen and paper or pencil and paper.
Right.
Because pen to paper probably doesn't work.
A lot of scratch outs. Yeah.
a lot of whiteout. There's a blast from the past using whiteout.
Right.
No, the reason why demand forecasting is so important in schedules is it helps ensure that you have the right number of people to get the work done. So in a store, all of these demand drivers, they're indications of work. That's a measurement of the work that's needed, the number of people that are needed to complete a task. And if you don't forecast the work correctly, the number of customers coming to the store, how many cartons or items need to be stocked on a shelf, or the time it takes to complete a particular type of sale or create a product, if you are a business that creates products that are on demand. Without that demand forecasting, you're either not going to service customers well, which you could leave sales on the table right there on that spot. We may be leaving sales on the table long-term because that customer doesn't come back. Or it could be the impact of, you didn't forecast correctly. And so the item isn't even on the shelf or available to be purchased, but it's in the stock room. And I think every retailer has heard the adage, you don't sell from the stock room.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's the impact of demand forecasting. If you don't have the demand forecasted properly, whatever your goods are or your service is, you may not be meeting the needs of your customer, and you're losing and ultimately you're leaving sales on the table.
Right. Wow. I'd love to say ditto to that. I speak to a lot of retailers just because of the nature of my role at Legion, but also because of my podcast and just in general, because of the close connection that we have with retail. And I can't stress enough how many people are really living in the dark ages with technology in terms of like businesses that are not focusing on this critical opportunity, which is demand forecasting. And I get it. Some businesses are like, well, our business is simple. We have people who are working, 3 different shifts throughout the day, and we're open Sunday to Saturday, but it's pretty much all the same. But really, that's not necessarily true. We know that we know from forecasting that, and just as former retailers ourselves, that businesses fluctuate. I mean, that's why there's a fourth quarter. That's why holiday business drives business up and traffic up, right? It's why weather affects traffic and business alike. So I think if anyone listening is saying to themselves, well, my business is kind of simple. It doesn't matter whether your business is simple or complex. There is always a demand driver, and there is always forecasting that can help improve the realities for your team and for your business, which, as we, of course, talk about the business, we do have to talk about the team. We know that this is a huge part of what we do at Legion is focus on the hourly employee. It's obviously integral to this podcast, hence our name is the Frontline. So we always want to keep the focus on the frontline employee experience as well. But how does better demand forecasting have a positive impact on frontline workers?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways. We can look at it the overscheduling of employees, and then we'll look at it the underscheduling of employees and what's the impact on morale. When you overschedule employees because you haven't forecasted demand properly, you have employees who are standing on idle. And most people every day, they like to know that they accomplished something. And just standing around doing nothing because there wasn't work, the forecast wasn't correct. I mean, short term, maybe there's not a huge impact, but long term, that erodes your sense of self-worth and that you accomplished something, that your time is being well spent. On the flip side of that, if you are understaffed because you didn't forecast demand correctly, well, now you don't have enough people to service customers. Customers are angry. And customers are blaming the employee for something not being on the shelf, or something being out of stock, or for the long line of the cashier or to check out. And this is an hourly worker. They're getting blamed by angry customers for whatever that inconvenience is to the customer. That's not a fun place to work either. And so neither side, being over or under, is particularly good for employee morale.
This is a really good point. I don't know that I've made the complete connection there, that it's the hourly employee who faces the blame from the disappointed and angry customer, that the business has failed to staff their stores or their business appropriately. It's never the manager that gets the wrath of the customer. It's always the person right in front. Of course, the manager will get some of that, especially some of the heat if a customer is asking to speak with them. But it is that person who already has a ton of weight on their shoulders because they're already carrying the business on their own when there probably should be and needs to be more support, hence the importance of forecasting. And we know, and we've kind of talked about this on episodes previous to this one too, that many employers, especially retailers and hospitality businesses, are still faced with a difficult labor market. So how can demand forecasting enable employers to maximize the labor that they do have? And you kind of touched on this just before, but really thinking about how demand forecasting affects the way businesses even view their staffing needs.
Yeah. So with great demand forecasting, you also are able to tie back. So let's say you demand forecasting and you have forecast X number of customers, X amount of workload, and you're able to do it by the hour or by the day, perhaps even more granularly. Well, now you know when you need to have people. And yes, you can write a schedule around that, but what if you don't have the people for that, or you're short on people? Well, now at least you can know, hey, I need to hire for Friday nights, or I need to hire for Saturday mornings. And that is where you start your hiring, because you just know that's where your gap is. And so demand forecast is what enables that, or demand forecasting is what enables that.
Yeah. This makes me think back to the time that I was on the customer side of Legion. And I've shared this, I think, probably even in the first episode that I did for this podcast, which is that I used to work at SMCP, and we implemented Legion while I was there. And I was the project manager of the rollout. And I vividly remember when we had first started rolling out Legion, we thought we were, had some understaffing issues in some stores, but overall pretty decently staffed, especially in our higher volume locations. And I'll never forget when we started looking at the forecasting, and it was like we were understaffed in all of the places where we thought we were fully staffed. And it wasn't just a moment of reckoning for those of us that were like, oh, we're totally fine. It enabled us to actually leverage the employees that we had that weren't really getting that many hours potentially. You know, when you have a part-time, especially for businesses that lean on a part-time workforce, you're limiting people at a certain number of hours in order to keep them probably under 25 to 28 hours a week. But sometimes you realize just in having data accessible to you that actually there's a greater need there. And something I always like to connect this point that, you know, when we talk about hours, we're actually talking about like the livelihood for human beings. And so when we think about a difficult labor market, it's not just that people are looking for different or better jobs. It's that they're looking to elevate their income. They're looking to elevate their livelihood, their experience as a human being. And if a business can do that just by reinvesting their money into the people that are already there, I mean, there's a net positive there. Even it's going to, you know, it's just a matter of like where you're putting the money that you're already spending. And why would you bring someone in for 10 hours a week when you could just give that 10 hours to someone who's been committed to you for two? So what? They become full time, but they've been committed to you for however long. And now your money is potentially invested in a smarter place.
No, you're absolutely right. And the employee that you've had for a long period of time, or even a short period of time, the employee that you already have is probably more productive than the employee will bring in, at least for the first several weeks or several months.
Right. Totally. And I'm sure you and I can both even think back to a moment where we were hourly employees and we had an opportunity where we were invested in some way. It really goes a long way. It builds confidence for the person. Of course, it cushions their bottom line. Like it makes them feel better financially. But it is, to your point, on the basis of productivity, I always see this, you know, we're looking at this like corporate challenge, which is staffing stores appropriately and making sure that businesses are using their dollars in the best way possible. But actually it has such a direct impact on the person that is running your business, on the employee, on the managers as well. I just love that this topic is felt by all involved in an organization. Mm-hmm. That's my takeaway.
Indeed. And sometimes that reinvesting of labor, it's not just reinvesting into your own people, but it's also reinvesting it into your customers, into the service of the business. Think about, so bring it back to demand forecasting. If you're overstaffed, so you know your demands, so being able to forecast correctly or being able to schedule correctly relies on having a good forecast of how much work do you need at every given hour. Now, let's say that you are overscheduled in the mornings by an hour. Well, that overscheduled hour comes from somewhere, most likely, because it's your labor budget. And for most companies, isn't infinite. Mm-hmm. There is a budget, and you have to live within that budget. And if you have an extra hour of coverage in the morning or 2 hours of coverage in the morning that isn't exactly needed, it's coming from somewhere. It could be coming from your peak hours. And so every hour that you overspend or you didn't need to spend in one area is probably coming from some area where it is desperately needed.
Right.
And so demand forecasting helps you reinvest time from where it's not needed or not as productive to times when it's going to be really, really felt.
I love that. Actually, I think it's a perfect segue because this is probably the question that I have for you is my most anticipated question because as an HR person, in my mind, I always think about how it feels for someone when we talk about things like labor costs and labor savings. And of course, there are stigmas associated with just that terminology alone. But I think it's important to break down what that actually means because it isn't inherently a bad thing, especially now that we understand how demand forecasting can and does positively influence employee experience and customer experience, which then in turn influences employee experience. So I'm curious, like, what can 1% of labor savings do for a business? And how can this, if at all, positively impact employees on the front line? And maybe there's even an opportunity to break down, why those stigmas are stigmas and why they're not inherently bad.
Yeah, there's always this stigma around optimizing labor means cutting labor.
Yeah.
And that doesn't need to be the case. Sometimes that is the case, but that doesn't need to be the case. It's just a matter of moving hours from peak hours, moving labor from peak hours from non-peak hours into peak hours. Mm-hmm. when you think about it, your peak hours are such a small percentage of a business the total time that a store is open. A lot of businesses have a peak hour sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening. It's the rush hour peak. Or some business may have a morning peak because they're coffee or breakfast oriented. Whenever those peaks are, pulling an hour from the other 80% of the day to help fill that 1 or 2 hour spike makes such a major impact on the customer service, on the employees' experience, not just the customer experience, but the employees' experience for that hour, because they had the resources they need. They had the number of people that were necessary to serve the demand that was coming in. That is just such an impactful thing. Like, yes, that is that 1% of labor that is being reinvested into the right percent of time. 1% isn't a lot, but that's all that's needed. A couple hours, and for most businesses operate between 200 and 500 hours per week, unless you're a really big box retailer. Well, that's only a couple hours. Those couple hours are so impactful during peak hours. And so how do you measure that 1%? Yes, you have your sales lift, you have your expenses, but then you also have the turnover. You can impact turnover. You can measure customer satisfaction. And so there's just so many different measures, some that are very easy and hard to measure. I mean, like quantifiably hard. I mean, like hard savings or hard measurements, and others that are, I call them fluffier measurements, where it's a little bit softer, a little bit harder a little bit more difficult to quantify, but you know that it's making a material impact.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, I think, of course, stigmas come from somewhere. And to your point, sometimes that labor cost is a reshuffling or an optimizing of the people that run the business. But I really can only stress this point again that you mentioned, that, it's about reinvestment. It's about taking the dollars that a business already has and placing them in a part of the operating window and the operational hours that drive better business, that drive better employee experience and drive better customer experience. And all of this impacts and has to be focused on the hourly employee. I always say this, that when someone is making a decision at the corporate level for a business, who is their audience? At the end of the day, if it's a retailer, it's a hospitality business, any of these industries that we've been talking about, that audience for them is their hourly employee and their customer. And so if we know that there are probably 5 hours in a day that could be peak times, or even less than that, to your point, it could be 1 hour, why wouldn't you look at the data that is inevitably there, that you either are using or not using? It's there. You just have to find a way to measure it. And taking that and actually leveraging the data in order to then forecast better business and do all of these things that you're talking about. That demand forecasting is probably the most impactful piece of data that a business can have, and yet it's like the most underutilized.
It's the foundation to being able to schedule correctly. It is the foundation of the whole, everything that gets built on top of it. The number of people, the timing, the schedules, all of that is the foundation is demand forecasting. And it's also the most difficult thing to do for a human. A human is not great at demand forecasting.
No. I can tell you, as someone that spent hours and hours and hours scheduling back in the day, I am not as good as a computer or technology at figuring out and understanding like the points of that go into forecasting a business. And that's the thing, like, I hear this a lot from retailers too, like, oh, my manager, they know their business inside and out. And that is true. There is no arguing that, but they do not know the business the way a computer or technology will, because it's just, there are so many data points. There's so much to remember, and we inevitably make mistakes because we're human and we're supposed to make mistakes. But, when you can leverage technology to do the heavy lifting, you're then, of course, enabling managers to spend time on more impactful parts of the business too.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, that is my last question for you, with the exception that I ask every guest this final and lasting question that hopefully listeners kind of walk away from episodes feeling a little inspired or having another kind of takeaway with them. So this question, again, I ask every guest, and it is, what is the best advice you received or have received that you continue to live by?
So I'm going to butcher this quote and this advice. This was something that was given to me, I believe, probably within the first month or two of starting work at Dollar General, and as an executive was coaching. Again, I'm going to butcher this, but it's some balls are made of rubber, some balls are made of glass. Know which are which. And what it boils down to is that some balls you can drop, they'll bounce up and you can continue. Other balls, other things in life are glass. You drop them once, they shatter and you can't put them back together. And so it actually ties in really well with our topic today, because there's always more in life than you can get done, and you can't buy extra time. So you got to focus on your priorities, make sure that you're working on the right things, and which I think that just ties in so well to this topic, but purely by coincidence.
I love that, and I'm going to have to noodle on this one. It makes you think about all the times where you treat everything like glass or you treat everything like rubber. And actually the reality is that it's probably a perfect balance between the two. And it's just a matter of making sure you're not dropping the glass probably at any point. Right. And it's really, that's really interesting. I've never heard that before. I like it.
I'm sure I butchered the quote. I'm sure the quote was a lot more profound. Hopefully that was just the takeaway from it, though.
I think you did a great job. And I appreciate that you came on the podcast. I think that anyone listening to this episode is going to have a lot to think about, not only in that advice, but also in the way that they view business and employees and labor, because it's all interconnected. And this is, again, if anyone is taking this and reflecting on your advice, then they have a lot to think about.
Well, thank you for having me, Tracy. It's been fun to join this podcast.
Yes.
So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Maybe we'll have you on again. Probably. You're a wealth of knowledge.
I look forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony.